Our first presenter is Dr. Craig Wright and CEO of N-Chain, Jimmy Nguyen. Please give them a round of applause.
All right, hi everyone, I'm Jimmy Nguyen. I know a lot of you in the room. I'm CEO of N-Chain. I'll be leading our presentation today with Dr. Wright. First of all, I want to begin by thanking everyone for being here, because we're here because we all care and love about Bitcoin. And while we may have some philosophical differences that I think it's important to talk about today, I think it's important to remind everyone that everybody in this room is here because they care about creating a Bitcoin protocol that we believe will fulfill Satoshi's vision, because that's what Bitcoin Cash was birthed to do. It was to restore what Bitcoin was from BTC, and that's going to frame a lot of our conversation today.
More than that, it restores right back to the beginning. Yeah. Bitcoin should have been set in stone. And I mean, there are lots of arguments in the early days. Thamos and Blue Matt and Mike Hearn and everything like that argued over block height as op block height. And even Thamos and Blue Matt agreed. Adding time-based external state was a really stupid thing to do. And then, of course, they can't figure out how to get Lightning working, so what do? CLTV, which is just block time.
So I know we have time dedicated later after the opening presentations for questions and answers. So I actually want to use our time this morning to talk about some overarching issues which explain, I think, our position on what should happen with the Bitcoin protocol, and save some of the technical details of different features to later for discussion, because we have our lead developer Steve Shatters with us, as well as one of our solution architects, Andy Mee, who's working on this, who can answer a lot of the questions. What I want to talk to you about today is our belief that the Bitcoin protocol, what we all need for everyone's benefit, is something that's stable, it's scalable, and it's secure. So I want to describe what we mean by that. What we mean by that is what we're proposing with our newly announced Bitcoin SV, designed to restore the original Satoshi Vision. I know a lot of people have been asking to see code. We just released overnight just an alpha preview of the code on a GitHub repository. You can check it out. It's not designed to be tested yet. That's going to start in about a week or so, and Steve can tell you more about that. But we're moving our process along. In addition, also announced overnight is the launch of a pool directed by Craig here, SV pool, for miners who want to join in running a node implementation that fulfills the vision we're going to talk about. So that's open for pre-registration. A lot of people have already pre-registered, and this is part of our path to providing a choice for miners, because we think that's really important, that miners have a voice and a choice in what is happening with the Bitcoin roadmap. So we believe it's time for Bitcoin as an entire world and ecosystem to grow up and professionalize. And that's what we're advocating. And what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is a protocol that is stable. If you go back to some of the early Satoshi writings, the nature of Bitcoin is such that once version 0.1 was released, the core design was set in stone for its lifetime, what Craig just mentioned. Now, do we mean that not a single change can ever happen again? No, that's ridiculous. But we do believe that just like the internet lives on a protocol that has changed very little since its beginning and allowed businesses to build applications and websites on it reliably, that the Bitcoin Cash blockchain needs to get to that point as well. A reliable, stable protocol that doesn't involve disagreements between developer groups every 6 months or 3 months about what features should go in or not, because that's not helpful for anyone. And that's why we're advocating taking the steps that are necessary, which have started, to restore what was the original Bitcoin protocol and lock it down except for any critical changes that people can propose from time to time. But we have to create something stable for the major enterprises of the world to build on top of.
And proposing doesn't mean you just put it out there. It means you come out with use cases, with data, with testing. And not a little bit, a lot. You have to convince the majority of miners, and that's not going to happen the way it was ever again.
So the best way for you to all think about it is, we want businesses of the world to build on top of this blockchain. Do you want them to build on sand, or do you want them to build on rock? And the reason that's important to keep in mind is, A lot of us in this room are not running major enterprises. But when we talk to the major enterprises of the world, when they're considering building on Bitcoin Cash, the first questions they ask us are about, is it going to be scalable enough to support this big project we have? At what point in the future can we actually implement? Should we invest millions of dollars from our business to start building this particular project if we don't know the chain is going to scale, or we don't know what the protocol is going to be looking like in a year or 2 years from now? And those are the really pragmatic conversations that major enterprises have to have before they decide to build on something. And that's why we're advocating creating a protocol that's solid rock that gives reliability to the major enterprises of the world, because that's what's going to lead to growth and scale of the network. So the benefits we're advocating are that there shouldn't be unnecessary experiments and changes on the Bitcoin Cash protocol. If we lock down the protocol and allow it to scale, what happens? A lot of the disagreements that have emerged over the last few months are unfortunate, but they're the natural result of having a decentralized development community. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it inhibits the growth of the network. We think it's better, once you have a locked protocol, to let the business developers of the world create their applications and their projects on it, and we don't have to be engaging in unnecessary debates every 6 months among developer groups about particular features. It actually creates a better, stable ecosystem for everyone, and it provides more certainty, which at the end of the day leads to growth of a network, which means more money for miners and more revenue for all of the businesses that operate on it. Stability is good for any business ecosystem. We also need something that's scalable. And I know there are certain disagreements in the Bitcoin Cash developer community about how you achieve scaling. And it's okay to have different opinions. But I think we have to remember that even in its earliest days, from the early Satoshi writings, it was predicted that Bitcoin can already scale, this is way back then, larger than the Visa network could, with existing hardware back then for a fraction of the cost. That was always the vision. Craig, thoughts on that?
Basically, it was never meant to be a home user network. I don't care whether people like that or not. I don't give a shit whether they like that or not. It was designed for data centers. It's designed to be money. You never get 5 billion people using anything that's going to run as home hobby nodes. And if you want home hobby nodes, go make yourself a shitcoin, because Bitcoin's growing up.
And so that, of course, was also part of early Satoshi posts, which is that the design was supporting letting users be users, and the burden is to run a node, and then the fewer nodes there will be, and that will result in big server farms. Some people resist that. We don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that, and it's what's going to allow Bitcoin to grow up and professionalize. So what does this mean in economic terms? We did some modeling over the last week at nChain using some of our business analysts to evaluate why it's so important to scale fast and now in terms of block size. And the reason is there's a direct economic need for miners. In 2 years, the block reward will be split in half again to 6.25 Bitcoin Cash. So anyone who's mining now will in 2 years receive half of what they're receiving today. In order to maintain even current profitability, what that means is in 2 years, then they have to make up that 6.25 coins worth of value in something else, which has to come in transaction fees and which has to come in higher transaction volume.
And it doesn't happen because you have less coins.
And so,
some of these idiot ideas, like BTC love to say, there's less coins so the price will double.
Right.
Bullshit. There are not less coins, there are less coins being mined. What we'll find is this idea of a Ponzi dump, the speculation, is going to end. And in 2 years' time, we're going to get to a point where it halves and the price does not increase.
And so what we have to do is prepare the network now for the massive scaling that's needed to ensure miners have the same economic incentive to continue mining, to continue to secure and grow the network. So what does that mean in the future? That means miners are going to depend more on transaction fees and volumes. The revenue streams will diversify. It just won't be the pure payment transactions, which will be the cheapest. They require the less data, but things such as token usage, smart contract usage, application applications that embed data and files in op return, and as well as a whole host of other things we're seeing from companies approaching us.
And very simply, if you pay a miner, it's not spam.
Individual transaction fees, we still know want to be kept low because, of course, we want people to be using the network, particularly for its pure original purpose of electronic cash. But that means you have to have higher transaction volume, and that means the block size has to be significantly increased now. So let me walk you through some modeling we did. And this is rough, and I don't ask you to accept it as exact science. You might play with the variables we inserted in your own way, but the lesson at the end of the day is going to be clear. We did a modeling of what transaction fees would need to be to make up for the 6.25 BCH value that will be lost in 2 years in block reward. We did it at 3 different BCH price points in 2 years, assuming the coin is worth $1,000 US, which means you have to make up $6,250 worth of block reward. At $5,000 US, meaning you have to make up $31,000 plus, and at $10,000, meaning you have to make up about $62,500. We did it based on various transaction types, assuming that you would have a mix of transactions in a block, right? Because one block is not just going to only have purely payment transactions. The transaction types we evaluated just as a start were payments, which are very simple at 225 bytes, maybe smart contract transactions at 1,000, and tokens at 1,500 bytes. There will be more, but this is just a start for evaluation. We also did it at 3 possible transaction fee levels, and the amounts here are expressed in US dollars as opposed to Satoshi, but per byte, with the idea that fees might be really low, medium, or high, depending on how the network evolves. When you model that out, and you look at, well, what would be the transaction fees that happen? Of course, they're going to depend on the size of a transaction. At a low fee, which we modeled that at 0.00009 of a US dollar, so fractions of a cent per byte, a payment transaction, and this is still high. You know, we think payment transactions should be less, but just for purposes of this valuation, at a low fee, 2 cents, smart contract transactions could be 9 cents, token transactions might be 13 cents. We did it for medium and high fees, and we recognize that each block is going to carry a different proportion of any of these transactions in any given block. You couldn't exactly predict it, but we're looking at averages. And so this actually assumes higher fees than we think would be ideal, but that means that even if you have higher individual transaction fees, that's going to require large blocks. So then we evaluated, well, what would be the total number of transactions you needed in order to fill a block to get enough transaction fees to make up this last block reward? If the block capacity was filled entirely with just payment transactions, the smallest ones, then you need a lot of them, right? You'd need like 1.6 million individual transactions to generate the fee amount for the medium coin price target of 5,000 US dollars. If you did a mix where we just assumed 40% payments, 30% smart contract transactions, and 30% token, you would need a smaller number because some of these have larger data size, so about 800,000 total transactions in a block. So what does this ultimately mean for block size? And this is what's so critical to our belief of why we have to start scaling larger now. In the low transaction fee scenario, we priced out what is the minimum block capacity needed to have those transactions that would generate the value of 6.25 BCH. Okay, at a minimum, you would need, if the low fee transactions, at $1,000 for a Bitcoin, 67.1 megabytes, at 5,335, and at 10,670.6 megabytes. But that's assuming the entire block is full, and we never want to get to a network where the block is 100% full. This is just the minimum space that's needed to fit those transactions to generate that block reward. Ideally, Craig's belief is that you should have a network where the block's cap is 50 times the daily average to ensure the throughput you need to grow, at least. So so we then calculated what would the maximum block size be at its highest, assuming a 2% block utilization, right? And then also, if you wanted to get, a different approach, 10%, which we never really want to get to, but if you want to be a little more conservative, you could do that. But at the low transaction fee scenario, it's telling you that you need max block sizes in 2 years of 3.3 gigabyte, 16 gigabyte, or even 32 gigabyte. The scenarios change if the transaction fees go higher. You don't need as big blocks because the transaction fees are higher.
And of course, the other problem though, if transaction fees are higher, then we won't get the volume because we compete with other industries and other things like that. So unless we keep this low, which means big blocks, we lose.
But even under the higher transaction fee scenarios, you're still talking about needing fairly large block sizes. Here, 1.3, 6.5, or 13 gig. And even at the smallest, you're talking 894 megabytes or 4 or 8 gigabytes. That's in 2 years. If we have to get to that point, or anywhere near that point, you can play with my variables, you can, fiddle around with the numbers in ways you think are more acceptable to your way of thinking, but the same conclusion is going to be reached. You need to start getting bigger blocks to support the transaction volume and capacity needed to ensure that miners continue to make the same revenue necessary to make up for the block reward halving. That is happening in 2 years. If we have to get anywhere near 16 gigabytes in 2 years, we can't wait a year from now. We have to start that process now. That's critical because otherwise, in 2 years, mining is going to become less profitable, and that threatens the whole viability and security of the network if the miners cannot make up the actual revenue they need to make up in transaction volume and fees.
More than that, people are already starting to look to the future and what they can do. They have options right now. They can either move into Bitcoin Cash, but that means they need to know in 2 years' time that it will be there for them to actually put their transactions on. And this is the thing. It takes 2 to 3 years for real organizations to actually build applications. Everyone thinks this is a shit show where you write a quick app in 3 weeks. You don't. Real organisations spend years. When I worked at the Australian Stock Exchange, the Nipper network took 5 years of development. They planned 5 years on that network. That's a real exchange. SBI know these sort of things. 2-year planning. You don't put millions into these things thinking, oh, it's okay, the protocol should be okay in 2 years. You want to know it's going to be the same, no changes now, and 6, 8, 10 years down the track, or you don't do it.
So our calls for increased scaling now are not just arbitrary. It's not because Craig and I or the N-Chain team sat around and said, oh, we just need 128 megabytes or we need whatever number you want to throw out. It's based out of our instinct that there is a financial imperative for the mining network and their revenue to start scaling and scaling now. And the other reason it's driven by is the conversations we have with major businesses who come to us saying, hey, can you help us figure out how to implement blank on the Bitcoin Cash blockchain, a property title registry, a new way of doing smart contracts, a decentralized stock exchange, all of these kinds of things companies talk to us about. But they're reluctant to even begin development because the network capacity is not there. And they don't know that it's going to be there. And it takes, as Craig said, some of these businesses at least a year, sometimes 2 years, to build a sophisticated project, which they'll do on the internet because it's stable, but they are reluctant to even start doing. And unless we as a community can convince them that this protocol is both stable and scalable at mass scale, it's not going to happen. We just talked last week with a company that's got a venture to do property title registry on the blockchain. They would prefer to do it on the Bitcoin Cash blockchain, but because they want to record not just the ownership of title, but to include 3D graphic image files of the property of a building, a piece of land, that requires huge amounts of data.
And pay a premium.
And they would pay a massive premium in transaction fee for the ability to do that. But they can't even start thinking about it on Bitcoin Cash with its current network. And you may think that's not important, but that is where the future of transaction volume, transaction fees, and miner premium fees is going to lay.
That group alone would be willing to pay enough so that there would be an annuity cost on the cost of their data. By an annuity cost, I mean life. The upfront payment of hard drives for the entire existence of the human race. They would pay that upfront at a premium for a distributed network that would support 1,000 different miners, more than we have now. I mean, as in mining pools, the lot. That's what people will pay to put on this thing.
Yeah, and so we are encouraging moving to that because that will ensure the viability of the network and its growth. And we have to stop thinking about Bitcoin Cash purely as its original, and we still think lead purpose, electronic cash. That alone is not going to sustain the growth of the network given the mining block reward halving that's going to come. And it won't get big businesses to come make this what we think it should be, the global public ledger of the future. Just like we all live and operate on a single internet, a public internet, we really believe and are trying to move the crypto and blockchain world to operating on a single public ledger, which is the Bitcoin Cash blockchain.
And in discussions with people like the World Gold Council, just their settlement data, not trades, will exceed gigabyte blocks. Just daily settlement.
So then it gets to the question of, all right, there's philosophical differences right now between the developer groups about what we do with block size. When we announced the desire to launch our Bitcoin SV project, we're believing that the default block size should be set to 128 megabytes. And now maybe you can understand why that's just not some arbitrary number. That's a path to getting to what we think it needs to be in 2 years. However, we're also, and Craig's been tweeting about this as well, perfectly open to the idea of just not really having a cap at all and letting it be miner configurable, because at the end of the day, we believe miners should be directing much of the roadshow of what happens with Bitcoin development, as opposed to just the developer groups. And that's okay. They are the primary key users that sustain the network. And it would allow them to configure based upon what market demands are, what market usage is, what their own individual desires are in terms of what types of transactions and capacity to mine. So those are two different approaches with which we're perfectly happy, and I think that a lot of people would be perfectly happy with a miner configurable approach. And Bitcoin ABC has max block size configurable now in debug settings, so it's not apparent to a lot of miners. And one of the things we want to do in Bitcoin SV is actually move this and make it much more prominent. Steve helped me put together this slide which shows how you get to the debug settings. You have to get to Bitcoin D-help-debug, and you'll see this long list of things, and you'll eventually get to this, which is about where you don't accept block size larger than a particular limit. So it's there. It's actually similar to Bitcoin Unlimited's emergent consensus approach. So a miner configurable approach, I think, is actually very consistent with approaches that different developer groups have taken. So in SV, as Steve can explain to you more later, he'll make it more prominent in terms of the setting. Here he added this as an example of where you could see it, and we'll also show the settings in the default RPC get info results. Finally, let me talk about security. We all agree that it's important for the Bitcoin Cash network to be as secure as possible. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. We also agree that you don't just start scaling to bigger and bigger blocks just arbitrarily, that you want security confirmed in that. And so, as Steve and Andy can talk about with you more later, we are starting our own gigablock testnets, starting 2 of them, actually 3, but 2 ourselves and 1 with an outside party, to continue the testing that others have started, such as Bitcoin Unlimited. We'll be releasing data of that as it comes along. He's going to be working on code improvements, and there's other things we can do with hardware acceleration that will help support security of it. We've just finished discussions with an outside security firm that will be engaged to audit the Bitcoin SV code, and we'll continue using them, as well as a public bug bounty program, to begin the steps to doing what major software development firms do, what a Microsoft would do, what a Google would do with software. They take steps to professionalize the process. And there's nothing wrong with that. Not only is there nothing wrong with it, it's where the community needs to move. Here are things that Steve is planning with our team for a safe upgrade. We'll be using the gigablock testnets we're running for stress testing. We'll provide data to the mining community so they can make their own decisions about what would be safe block sizes. We don't want to be the ones telling them every 6 months, here's what the block size should be. We can certainly provide data, make recommendations, but let it up to the miners to decide what they want to do, making informed choices on risk and reward, because we want to empower them to make their own choices.
And this should not be a developer choice. This should be a competitive choice. Miners should compete to be the best. And the thing is, we don't want to support every laggard miner at home. We want the best miners running this network for profit. And if that means 20% of the bottom ones drop off, that means the top ones make more profit. If there's more profit, then it attracts better people into the industry. That's how capitalism works. That's how free markets work, without any technocrat telling the free market what to do.
So we were going to spend some time talking about some of the issues with changing the protocol, but I'll save that for question and answers later when we get into some of the technical feature discussions. So let me close by just summarizing what we think are the advantages of the approach we're advocating. We don't think it's entirely irreconcilable with other teams' approaches, and I want to be clear, we do not want a split of Bitcoin Cash. We do not want a split of the work that this people in this room have done for so long, because a lot of people worked very hard in this room to create what is Bitcoin Cash, and I think we're all very thankful and grateful. We do think that what the discussions that have happened over the last few months have revealed is there's just a different philosophy about where we should be going and who should be directing the roadmap. We think we should be going quickly to a scalable, very scalable, but stable and locked protocol so that the developer groups aren't having these unnecessary disagreements in the future. And we believe the choices should be driven by miners, and we should give them the choices to do that.
Bitcoin is not about having everyone run their node. That is not what decentralization was ever about. It is stable money. Right back from the beginning, there is one thing Bitcoin was designed to deliver, first and foremost, is stable money. It has a distributed system because any system that has a single player can be shut down, changed, or altered. It is not stable. It is only through competition from the best miners competing that we end up with stable money.
So let me conclude by summarizing what we think are advantages of the approach we're advocating. We want scaling quickly and safely, but I explain why. This is not just because Craig woke up and said, oh, we want bigger blocks. There is an imperative economically built into the system to do this and do it now. We want to lock the original Bitcoin protocol so that businesses can reliably build on it, professionalize the whole process with quality assurance and security audits, promote zero-conf security. We want to create a pathway to rapid Bitcoin adoption globally, and not just for payments, but by the big enterprises, which will lead to the miner revenue, which is critical. Unless they are being profitable and making money, miners will not continue doing this after 2 years. And the approach we're advocating will also lead to premium services for them, such as data, such as this property registry type venture, for which they'll get paid more money, given the data capacity needed. And finally, we want to empower miners with choice and a voice in this process, and let them drive it, and let developer groups accomplish what they set out to do, restore Bitcoin, but then allow Bitcoin the room to grow and breathe in a way it never has really been allowed to do, and then see what happens. And if there are changes that people want to propose years down the road, fine, consider them. But do not make this an experiment every 6 months.
There was a comment 10 years ago. In 20 years, we will either have massive transaction volume or none. We are halfway. If we do not scale in the next couple of years, it's over. That simple. All your investment, piss it away in the wind. We either scale or you may as well go home now.
So I will leave you with this thought again. We need to create for the enterprises of the world the solid rock foundation that is massively scalable, and then they will come build. Otherwise, they will not come build on sand. So please keep that in mind as we engage in these discussions over the next hours and days, and we want to thank everyone for their passion and support of Bitcoin. We all have that as a common goal, and I think that's critical for us to all remember. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Wright and Jimmy Nguyen.